Missouri Senator Eric Schmitt was in Jefferson City today, hearing from disability rights advocates as part of a roundtable discussion. Joe McLean was there, and he asked the Republican senator about a recent DOJ report outlining Missouri's treatment of thousands of disabled Missourians.
As a reminder, that DOJ report found that Missouri inappropriately subjected more than 3,000 Missouri citizens with serious mental health disabilities to years-long stays in nursing homes by misusing the guardianship system.
Yeah, so as a caveat, I haven't seen that report, but generally speaking, we can do a lot better as it relates to intellectual disabilities, right?
During a Wednesday roundtable in Jefferson City, Republican Senator Eric Schmitt emphasized the need to create more opportunities for those living with disabilities, namely employment opportunities.
Allowing individuals with disabilities to save in a way that they're not punished, right, by way of benefits that they might otherwise receive is an important kind of reform that I've advocated for in the past and will continue to do.
But Schmitt also said there's still a lingering stigma around mental health disabilities, which he says needs to be corrected. Lydia XZ Brown agrees with that as the policy director for the National Disability Institute. They added, though, almost every single public policy issue affects the disabled community, which itself is an extremely diverse group with diverse needs.
People will come to the conversation with oftentimes misconceptions and preconceived notions about what a disability is and who counts as having a disability.
For example, Brown says people with disabilities are more likely to be living below the poverty line, more likely to experience housing insecurity or homelessness, domestic abuse, employment discrimination, and they're less likely to establish retirement security.
People with disabilities are affected by every single issue that is of concern to any community that cares about the future of humanity and that cares about the good of society.
Insurance marketplace website Policy Genius ranked Missouri as 25th among U.S. states that best accommodate those with disabilities. That factors in things like affordability, access to health care, and economic conditions. In Jefferson City, Joe McLean, KY3 News.